Three ranchers from the Texas Panhandle each hired a housekeeper through the same agency, but when the women arrived on the same wagon, they carried a secret that could get all of them killed. The summer of 1889 had baked the Caprock Escarpment into something resembling the surface of a cast-iron skillet left too long over an open flame. The grass had gone yellow in April. By June, the creeks that threaded through the canyon country southeast of Amarillo had shrunk to muddy ribbons that barely covered a boot heel. Three ranches sat within a half-day's ride of one another on that stretch of broken, beautiful land, close enough that the men who owned them had shared fence posts, winter supplies, and the occasional grim silence of mutual loss. Cormac Dre was the eldest of the three, 41 years old, and built like a cedar post that had survived too many storms to bother flinching anymore. His wife Nora had died of fever 3 winters prior, leaving him with a sprawling ranch house that echoed at night and 2 hired hands who couldn't cook worth a damn. His younger brother, Prentice, owned the middle spread, quieter than Cormac, a reader, the kind of man who kept a journal and felt embarrassed about it. Prentice's wife had left him, not to death but to a traveling merchant she'd met at a church social, and the wound was the kind that didn't scar over clean. The third rancher was Owen Holt, no relation to the Dreys by blood, but bound to them by the particular loyalty that forms between men who have pulled each other out of trouble often enough that keeping count becomes pointless. Owen was 34, raw-boned and sun-darkened, with the permanent squint of a man who spent his life reading weather in an open sky. It was Cormac who made the decision, the way he made most decisions, bluntly at the dinner table without ceremony. He had ridden over to Prentice's place on a Tuesday evening in late April with a folded advertisement torn from a Dallas paper, a domestic placement agency out of St. Louis, the Hearthside Bureau. They arranged housekeepers for frontier households, women of good character and practical skills, willing to relocate west. Prentice read the clipping twice and handed it to Owen, who had arrived uninvited, as was his custom. Owen read it once and shrugged in a way that meant yes. 3 letters went out the following week, 3 separate applications, 3 separate descriptions of what each man needed. Cormac asked for someone capable, unafraid of hard work, and unbothered by silence. Prentice, choosing his words carefully, requested a woman who appreciated books and didn't require constant conversation. Owen simply wrote that he needed someone who could manage a household, tend a kitchen garden, and not be frightened by horses. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he had a dog the size of a small bear and she would need to be tolerant of that as well. The Bureau wrote back promptly. 3 women had been selected: a Mrs. Loretta Brand, a widow of some practicality, a Miss Opal Fenwick, a school teacher seeking a change of circumstance, and a Miss Della Pruitt described as capable and adaptable, with experience in household management. The wagon arrived on the second Friday of July, rolling in off the main trail in a cloud of pale dust with the afternoon sun hammering down on its canvas cover. Cormac stood on his porch. Prentice and Owen had ridden over at dawn and were leaning against the fence post with their hats pulled low, watching. The wagon pulled to a stop. The driver, a wiry man named Potts who smelled of tobacco and bad decisions, climbed down and began untying trunks without introduction. The first woman stepped down from the wagon with the deliberate composure of someone who had spent the last 3 days deciding how she intended to present herself. She was tall, with dark chestnut hair pinned beneath a travel-worn bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water over limestone. A clear, shifting gray-green, she scanned the 3 ranchers with the calm, measuring look of a woman accustomed to being assessed and tired of it. The second woman followed. She was softer in appearance, with the same chestnut hair worn in a looser style that the wind had already partially undone, and the same gray-green eyes, though hers held a kind of careful watchfulness, as if she were perpetually calculating the distance to the nearest exit. She offered a small, polite smile to no one in particular. The third woman was last. She was younger than the other 2 by several years, slight, with her hair braided rather than pinned, and she carried a worn satchel clutched against her ribs like it contained something irreplaceable. Her eyes were identical to her companions, that same distinctive gray-green, and they were moving rapidly across the landscape with the alertness of someone who had recently learned that stillness could be dangerous. Cormac looked at the 3 women. He looked at his brother. He looked at Owen. Then he looked back at the women, at the matching line of their jaws and the identical color of their eyes, and the particular way all 3 of them were standing, shoulder to shoulder, unconsciously unified, like a formation. He stepped off the porch. "Your kin," he said. It was not a question. The tallest woman, the one the Bureau had listed as Loretta Brand, met his gaze without flinching. "My name is not Loretta Brand," she said. "It is Marguerite Lassiter. These are my sisters, Cecile and Fern. We are aware that we owe you an explanation." Owen pushed off from the fence post. Prentice straightened slowly, closing the book he'd been pretending to read. "You paid the Bureau to send you all to the same address," Cormac said. "We did," Marguerite confirmed. "We arranged it carefully. The Bureau's clerk believed she was handling 3 unrelated applications. She was not." She folded her hands in front of her with the precision of someone accustomed to maintaining composure under pressure. "If you wish to put us back on the wagon, I understand. But I am asking you not to." Cormac studied her. She didn't look away. Behind her, Cecile had gone very still, and Fern was gripping her satchel hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "Why?" he said. Marguerite took a breath that was steadier than it had any right to be. "Because we have nowhere else to go. And because the man who wants us dead does not yet know where we are." The silence that followed was broken only by the hot Texas wind moving through the scrub grass and Potts methodically dropping trunks into the dirt with complete indifference. Cormac looked at his brother again. Prentice gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Owen was already watching the tree line. "Get the trunks," Cormac said to Potts. "Inside." He held the door open without another word, and Marguerite Lassiter walked through it like a woman who had been gambling on that exact outcome and was too tired to feel relieved. The story came out that evening over a dinner that Marguerite cooked with mechanical efficiency while she talked biscuits, salt pork, beans, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. She spoke without self-pity, in the flat, composed tone of someone who had already survived the worst part and was now simply reporting the facts. Their father, Edmund Lassiter, had owned a freight operation out of St. Louis. 15 wagons, contracts with 3 railroad companies, a reputation built over 20 years of reliable work. 3 years ago, he had entered into a partnership with a man named Donahue Price, a financier with offices on the better side of St. Louis, and a smile that Marguerite, even then, had not entirely trusted. Price had offered capital to expand the operation westward. Their father had accepted. What followed was meticulous and patient destruction. Price had systematically shifted the freight contracts into shell companies he controlled, bled the operation of its assets through fees and misdirected payments, and when the books finally showed Edmund Lassiter as insolvent rather than prosperous, Price had stepped in to collect. He took the wagons. He took the contracts. He took the building on Olive Street where Lassiter Freight had operated for 2 decades. Their father had died 8 months later. Heart failure, the doctor said. Marguerite did not believe it was only that. She believed grief had a physical weight and that it had finally become more than he could carry. Price had come to their rented rooms 3 weeks after the funeral. He had brought 2 men with him and a proposal that he presented as though it were a courtesy. The debt their father had accumulated, much of it fabricated through Price's own accounting, remained technically outstanding. He would forgive it entirely, he said. In exchange, he wanted the 3 daughters. Not for anything he named directly. He simply said that he had associates who would find them useful, and that the alternative was a legal pursuit that would leave them destitute and without options. Marguerite had listened to the entire speech, thanked him for his visit, and shown him the door. That night she had woken her sisters, and they had packed what they could carry. Cecile had a contact at a church charitable organization who helped them move to a boarding house in Kansas City under different names. From there, Marguerite had found the Bureau's advertisement in a newspaper left behind in a reading room. She had understood immediately what it offered: distance, anonymity, and the one thing she needed most, the ability to keep her sisters together. "Price is not the kind of man who accepts being refused," Marguerite said, setting down her coffee. She looked at Cormac directly, the way she had on the porch. "He will look for us. He has resources and he has pride, and men like that do not stop because the task becomes inconvenient. I brought that to your doorstep. I thought you should know the full weight of it." The fire in the hearth shifted and resettled. Prentice had stopped eating. Owen was very still in the way that meant he was thinking hard. Cormac set down his fork. "How long ago did you leave Kansas City?" 6 weeks. "Does anyone there know where you went?" No one who would tell him willingly. Marguerite hesitated, just for a moment. There is one person, the clerk at the bureau. She knows the Texas address. She was well compensated for her discretion, but discretion has a price ceiling. Cormac nodded once, slowly. All right, he said. That was all he said. But Marguerite understood it. The weeks that followed rewired the quiet geometry of all three ranches. Marguerite took over Cormac's household with the focused efficiency of a general establishing supply lines. She reorganized the kitchen, identified what was needed, sent a list with Cormac to town, and by the second week had the ranch running on a schedule that the hired hands followed with something between respect and mild alarm. She was not warm exactly in those first weeks. She was competent and steady and entirely watchful, and Cormac found himself, for the first time in 3 years, looking forward to coming in from the range. He was not the kind of man who examined that feeling closely. He simply noted it and went back to work. Cecile went to Prentice's ranch and within 3 days had discovered his library, a genuine library for a Texas panhandle property, 2 full shelves of novels and histories, and 1 well-worn volume of poetry that Prentice clearly hoped she wouldn't notice. She noticed. She didn't mention it directly. She simply began leaving books on the kitchen table after she'd finished with them, covers up as an implicit invitation. Prentice started leaving his selections the same way. By the 3rd week, they were eating dinner in near total silence, but with a profound, comfortable sense of mutual occupation, like 2 people sharing the same good thought. Prentice had not felt like that in a long time. He wrote about it in his journal, and then felt self-conscious about having written it, and then wrote that too. Fern went to Owen's place, and the first thing that happened was that Owen's dog, a massive, mournful-faced hound named Governor, who weighed approximately as much as a small foal, pressed his entire head into her lap the moment she sat down and refused to move. Fern, who had spent weeks operating on pure controlled terror, suddenly had a 140-pound animal radiating warmth into her knees and looking at her with uncomplicated devotion, and something in her carefully maintained composure cracked along a seam she hadn't known was there. She cried quietly, just once. Owen pretended not to see it. He went outside and gave her the yard to herself for 20 minutes, and when he came back in, she was already up and examining the state of his kitchen garden with a focused, critical eye, and neither of them mentioned it. Owen was observant in the particular way of people who talk little. He noticed things and filed them away without drawing attention to the noticing. He saw how Fern checked windows before she sat near them. He saw how she went still at certain sounds. He began without comment to position himself between her and doors whenever strangers came to the property. Fern noticed this. She didn't say anything either, but she stopped flinching quite so much when he came in from outside. They were cautious with each other, polite and careful, like 2 people walking on ice they were not yet sure would hold. The trouble came 6 weeks after the women's arrival, on a Thursday afternoon when the sky had turned the particular greenish yellow that meant a storm was building out past the canyon rim. Cormac was mending fence on the south pasture when one of his hired hands rode up at a speed that meant something was wrong. A man had come into Durban, the nearest town, 12 miles east, asking about 3 women with chestnut hair. He was well dressed, carried himself like money, and was offering a significant sum for information. He had a companion who waited outside the saloon with his arms crossed, and the careful stance of a man paid for his capacity for violence. Cormac came off the fence and was moving before the hand finished speaking. He arrived at Prentice's ranch first and found Owen already there. Owen's hand had ridden over with the same news 20 minutes prior. The 3 men stood in Prentice's kitchen while the storm rolled in overhead, and Marguerite stood at the table with her arms crossed and her face very calm in the way that meant she was frightened and refusing to show it. "It's Price, man," she said. "The well-dressed one is how he operates. He sends someone presentable first to gather information, and then he sends the other kind." "How many of the other kind?" Owen asked. "Last time, 4. Marguerite met his eyes steadily. "He'll send more this time." Cormac looked at his brother. Something passed between them that needed no words. They had been having the same wordless conversation since childhood. Prentice turned and walked to the back room and returned with his rifle. Owen was already checking his. "You 3 stay inside," Cormac said. Marguerite said, "No." He looked at her. "I know what he'll do," she said, her voice flat and precise. Price's men work in two waves. The first is meant to draw everyone out front. The second comes from behind. She moved to the table and spread out the hand-drawn map of the property that Prentice used for managing his cattle range. If you concentrate everyone at the front of the property, he burns you from behind. He has done it before. I watched him do it to my father's warehouse. The room went quiet except for the storm beginning to knock at the windows. "Where's the weakness?" Cormac asked, studying the map. "The eastern tree line. It comes closest to the back of the barn." She pointed without hesitation. "If I were him, I'd bring the fire from there." Cormac looked at her finger on the map, then up at her face. "And Cecile and Fern?" "Cecile is a better shot than she looks. And Fern," Marguerite paused, and something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but depth. "Fern is the one who got us out of St. Louis. Don't underestimate her." The first men came at dusk, while the storm was in full throat. 3 riders who came straight up the main trail with the confidence of people who expected no serious resistance. They were met at the gate by Cormac and Owen, with rifles leveled and a calmness that gave the riders pause. The negotiation, such as it was, lasted 4 minutes and consisted primarily of Cormac explaining in a quiet, unhurried voice that they were trespassing on private property and that the next step was entirely their choice to make. The riders exchanged glances. They had been told to expect a couple of Texas cattlemen and 3 frightened women. They had not expected this. What they also had not expected was that while all eyes were on the front gate, Prentice had slipped through the back pasture in the rain and positioned himself in the loft of the barn with a clear view of the eastern tree line. He lay flat against the hay smell in the dark, his rifle resting on the edge of the loft door, watching the tree line with the patience of a man who had learned to be still. When 2 shapes moved out of the trees toward the back of the barn, each carrying a lantern and something that wasn't a lantern, Prentice let the first one get close enough to be certain. Then he fired once into the air, a warning shot, sharp and unmistakable, and called out in a clear, carrying voice that the next one would not be aimed at the sky. Both shapes stopped. Inside the main house, Cecile was at the rear window, with Owen's spare revolver, and Fern was beside her, with a particular quality of steadiness she carried in moments of actual crisis, all the nervous watchfulness falling away, replaced by a cold, functional clarity. When a third man tried the back door, testing the latch, slow and careful, Fern simply said through the door, "I can see your shadow under the frame. I am armed, and I know how to use what I'm holding. Please make a better decision." There was a pause. Then the shadow moved away from the door. The riders at the front gate, hearing the warning shot from the barn and no subsequent chaos, made their calculation. The odds had shifted. They wheeled their horses and rode back down the trail at a pace that confirmed they had not been hired for their dedication to the cause. The storm broke fully an hour later, rain hammering the flat lands so hard the lightning was more heard than seen. Cormac came in from the front, drenched and grim, and found Marguerite in the kitchen with a lantern and the coffee pot already on. She had a cut along her palm. She had put her hand through a window latch in the dark and not mentioned it, and she was wrapping it in a strip of cloth with the efficient self-care of someone accustomed to handling her own injuries. Cormac crossed the kitchen without speaking, sat down across from her, and took her wrapped hand in both of his. He examined the binding, tightened it where it had loosened, and tied it properly. His hands were careful in a way that his face and voice rarely were. Marguerite watched him do this. She did not pull away. "We can't wait for the next wave," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "Price will not stop sending men until there's a reason that has legal weight, something that makes coming after us more dangerous than it's worth." She looked at the lantern. "My father kept records. Before Price had the offices cleared, our father sent copies of his original contracts and ledgers to a solicitor in Kansas City. I've been in contact with him. He still has them. What's in those records contradicts every claim Price made to justify seizing the freight operation." Cormac was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" "To get those records to a federal land and commerce judge before Price's attorney can intercept them or buy the solicitor's silence." She met his eyes. "The circuit judge assigned to the Northern Texas Territory is based in Amarillo. I know his name. His reputation is clean." She paused. "But the route to Amarillo goes through Durban, and Price's men are still in Durban." Cormac was quiet for a moment. That's why you wanted to know about the property map, he said. You weren't just thinking about tonight. I'm always thinking about the next step, Marguerite said without apology. He looked at her in the lantern light, this woman who had arrived on his property under a false name and promptly made herself indispensable, and then informed him she had brought a war along with the biscuits. He had been angry about it in the first days. The anger had quietly and without fanfare transformed into something else, something that fit less easily into any category he had a word for. Get some sleep, he said. We ride at first light. The operation the following morning was unglamorous and methodical, which was, Cormac had long believed, how most things that actually worked tended to be. Owen rode ahead into Durban alone. He was less known there than the Drays, and confirmed that Price's well-dressed advanced man was still at the hotel, having taken a room, presumably waiting for his hired hands to report back. They had not reported back. Owen also confirmed, over a very unhurried cup of coffee at the diner, that the town's sheriff was a man named Aldous Frick, who had a long-standing personal dislike of outside money coming into his territory and telling it what to do. Owen explained the situation to Sheriff Frick with the economy of a man who respected other people's time. Frick listened with his arms crossed and the expression of a man whose day was being made worse, but who had seen worse days. This Price, Frick said. He's out of Missouri. He is. But... And he's been sending armed men onto private property in my county? He has. That. Frick uncrossed his arms. I've got a wire office. If these records exist in Kansas City, we can have a certified copy transmitted to the federal courthouse in Amarillo ahead of any petition Price's attorney files. He picked up his hat. I also have 2 deputies who have been looking for something useful to do this week. Marguerite sent the wire to the Kansas City solicitor herself, standing in the small, hot telegraph office in Durban with Cormac beside her and Frick's deputies, visible through the window. The solicitor wired back within the hour. The records existed. He had been waiting, he said, for someone to ask for them. What followed moved faster than Marguerite had allowed herself to hope. The certified copies reached the federal courthouse in Amarillo ahead of Price's attorney by one day that closed the window Price had relied on. The circuit judge, a deliberate man named Judge Calloway, no relation to the Canyon, reviewed the original contracts against Price's claimed ledgers and found what any honest reading of the documents revealed: a systematic falsification spanning 3 years, with sufficient documentary evidence to support charges of fraud, misappropriation, and coercion. Federal marshals arrived at Price's St. Louis offices on a Wednesday morning. He was in a meeting with his accountant. The irony of that was not lost on Marguerite when she heard, though she didn't smile about it until she was alone. The well-dressed man in Durban left on the noon stage when the news came through, leaving an unpaid hotel bill that Frick made a point of documenting. August settled over the Caprock with the same relentless heat it always brought. But something in the quality of the days had shifted. The ranches felt different. Not softer, exactly. The land was not soft and never would be, but inhabited in a new way, as if the buildings and fences had finally oriented themselves around actual lives rather than simply functional ones. Marguerite had not spoken of leaving, neither had Cecile or Fern. The question of the original contracts, housekeeper arrangements, technically still in effect, had never been formally addressed, which was a kind of address in itself. It was Owen who moved first, which surprised everyone, including Owen. He was not an impulsive man. But one evening in the kitchen garden, while Fern was examining the state of the tomato plants with the focused attention she brought to most things, he simply said, without preamble, that he would like her to stay, not as a housekeeper, as the person she was, staying in the place she'd been for 2 months, if she wanted to. Fern looked at him for a long moment. Governor, lying in the dirt between the tomato rows, looked at both of them with benign interest. Yes, she said, simple and without performance, which was the only way Fern said things that mattered. Prentice was less direct, but more thorough about it. He wrote Cecile a letter, which he left on the kitchen table beside a copy of a novel she'd mentioned wanting to read. The letter was 2 pages long and carefully argued its position, the way Prentice argued everything, with evidence and some vulnerability about the edges. Cecile read it twice, then went and found him in the barn and told him that he didn't need to build a case for it. She was already persuaded. Prentice, who had prepared rebuttals to 3 possible counterarguments, found he had nothing to say for a moment. Then he laughed, genuinely, for the first time in a long time, and the sound of it surprised them both. Cormac did not write a letter. He was not a letter-writing man. On a Sunday afternoon, when the heat had finally broken and there was an almost cool wind coming up from the canyon, he found Marguerite on the porch, reading through the Federal Commercial Statute Digest she had borrowed from Frick's office, because that was the kind of woman she was. He sat down on the step beside her. He was quiet for a while, which did not bother either of them. They had grown accustomed to silence together. "I want you to stay," he said. Marguerite set down the Statute Digest. She looked at the canyon in the distance, the late light making the rimrock look like hammered copper. "I came here under a false name," she said. "I know. I brought armed men to your property within 6 weeks of arriving. I'm aware. I reorganized your pantry without asking. It needed reorganizing." She looked at him then. The gray-green of her eyes had the quality in this light of water over stone, clear and deep and not entirely still. "Yes," she said. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the canyon shadows were still long and the scrub jays were arguing in the mesquite, a circuit preacher who was passing through on his regular route stopped at the Dre property for water and ended up staying for the afternoon. He conducted 3 ceremonies, one after another, in the shade of the big cottonwood beside the main house. The same tree Nora Dre had planted from a seedling 20 years prior, in the faith that it would grow into something worth sitting under. It had. Owen and Fern stood close, not touching until the moment they were supposed to, and then Owen held her hand with the careful steadiness of a man who intends to keep holding it. Prentice and Cecile exchanged vows in a way that felt like the continuation of a conversation they'd been having for months, which was more or less accurate. And Cormac stood before Marguerite in the shade of his late wife's tree and made a promise with the same unflinching directness he brought to everything, straightforward, unhurried, and meant to last. Marguerite made hers the same way. The preacher took his water, accepted a meal, and rode on to his next stop before sundown. The 6 of them ate dinner together on the long porch, the canyon turning purple in the fading light. Governor sprawled across 3 people's feet with aristocratic disregard for personal space. The Panhandle was not gentle country. It asked much and apologized for none of it. But sitting at that table in the last warmth of the day, with the threat finally extinguished and the silence finally peaceful rather than watchful, every one of them understood something they might not have found any other way. That the right people, arrived at through the strangest roads, can make even hard country feel like home. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it moved you at all, leave a like, share it with someone who loves the Old West, and subscribe to Noble Trials for new stories every week. I keep thinking about the moment Marguerite walked through that door. Not the courtroom, not the gunfight in the rain. Just that first moment on the porch when she had every reason to collapse and instead stood there and told the truth. That image stays with me longer than any of the action does. What strikes me most about this story is how everything that happened, good and bad, followed directly from choices people made. Price chose to build his wealth on fraud and coercion, and for a while it worked exactly the way he intended. He took Edmund Lassiter's life's work piece by piece, and when there was nothing left to take, he came for the daughters. That kind of thinking, that people are just another asset to be controlled, has a way of feeling unstoppable when you're on the receiving end of it, but it carries its own undoing inside it. A man who treats everyone around him as something to be used eventually runs out of people who will warn him when the ground is shifting. Marguerite didn't beat Price by being stronger than him. She beat him by being smarter, by understanding how he operated, where he would strike, what he would overlook. She knew his pattern, because she had studied it out of necessity. The way you study anything that is actively trying to destroy you. That kind of intelligence isn't something you're born with. It's built in hard rooms, through hard years, by people who refuse to stop paying attention even when paying attention is exhausting. I think about how easy it would have been for her to just run and keep running. Instead, she ran toward a solution. That distinction is everything. And then there was the matter of what she and her sisters held onto through all of it. They didn't abandon each other. Not once. Not when it would have been simpler. Not when the math of self-preservation might have suggested otherwise. There is something in that kind of loyalty that I find genuinely difficult to articulate. It isn't just love, it's a moral commitment, a decision made and remade under pressure to remain someone your people can count on. Cecile and Fern didn't just follow Marguerite, they showed up fully with whatever they each had to offer. Fern talked a man away from a door without firing a shot. Cecile held her position in the dark with a borrowed revolver. That's not instinct, that's character, built quietly over years of being the kind of person who doesn't leave. What I take from the story is something I come back to a lot, that integrity and intelligence without the willingness to endure are incomplete. Marguerite had all three, and so did Cormac in his way. A man who made a promise to a woman he barely knew and then went ahead and kept it. Under fire, in the rain, without making a performance of it. That quality, the willingness to simply hold your ground and do what you said you would do, is rarer than any particular talent or cleverness. Price had resources and power and patience. What he didn't have was any of that, and in the end, a ledger full of honest records, carried in a dead man's memory, and retrieved by his daughter, was worth more than everything he had built. That's not luck. That's how things actually tend to work when you look at them long enough.